Hello and welcome. In this episode, we are going to be taking a look at the word violet and how it has found a place in science, literature, and even the etiquette of death. The full etymology of the word violet is still being debated, with a history tracing back through French, Latin, ancient Greek, and possibly all the way to Middle Persian. To dive into the etymology, the word violet is the English derivation of the Old French violette, which comes from the Latin viola. The suffix let is placed at the end of a word to convey smallness, affection, or triviality to the subject, so having it at the end of violet refers endearingly to the small purple flowers that the plant produces. The Latin form of the word draws from aeon, the Greek word for violet, although it can also be used to mean flowers in general. As a side note, the word iodine is derived from the same Greek word. It is the English translation of the French word iode, which was the name given to the chemical due to its distinctive violet color. Aeon is thought to be a later form of wion or wia, which was used in an unknown Mediterranean substrate language, or a less used language which influences or is influenced by other languages. There are suggestions that this substrate language may be affiliated with the eastern side of the Mediterranean, and that the roots of the word violet are ultimately derived from Middle Persian van, meaning blue, with altered pronunciation being vyan, which itself would lend to the word wion. Although the meaning and phonetics of the word are compelling, this connection is just a theory that has not been definitively proven. But it is easy to see how the color violet could be likened to blue, given that it tends to be picked up by the human eye as a vibrant, cool-toned purple. But even though the name was originally given solely to describe the well-known purple flowers, the word has come to have several different definitions based on the context that it is being used in. Depending on how we are speaking about the color, violet can come about in different ways. Violet is considered to be a spectral color, or a color that can be picked up by a human eye with a single wavelength. This is as opposed to most shades of purple, which become visible due to varying combinations of red and blue light waves. Violet stands on its own as the last color in the visible spectrum, right before the transition to ultraviolet, a wavelength not visible to the human eye. Although when it comes to humans trying to synthesize the color, it, like purple in general, is commonly achieved through mixing red and blue in the right context. This can be found in the RGB light that is used in television, where it is synthesized using red and blue lights, as well as when creating the color out of primary colors, red, yellow, or blue, where it is also a composite of red and blue. In Greek mythology, violets were said to have been created by the virgin goddess Artemis. When Artemis's twin brother Apollo began pursuing one of the goddess's nymphs, all of which were sworn to be maidens just as their sovereign, Artemis transformed the girl into a violet in order to protect her, thus associating the little flower with modesty and purity. This symbolism carried on through the centuries to the famed language of flowers symbolic system used in the Victorian era. Another interesting side note in the history of violet's usage in Victorian society is that violet, along with lavender and shades of grey, were colors used in clothing as a signal of the later stages of mourning after the death of a loved one. For widows, the color would begin to be introduced during the latter stages of the 2.5-year mourning period, or sometimes even later depending on the person. This period of time was known as half-mourning or demi-mourning, and would usually last around 3 to 6 months. Although there does not seem to be a consensus on why shades of purple are the first to be introduced, there are some suggestions that it might be due to its ecclesiastical affiliations, violet being the color worn by bishops, or possibly due to the fact that violet often appears inherently darker than other colors due to the human eye being relatively insensitive to it. This makes it a bridge between the traditional Victorian morning color black and other colors. However, another likely explanation for the association of purple and black could be due to a different, more antiquated approach to color theory. But getting into medieval color theory is a big task, so we are just going to focus in on how purple worked within this system, particularly when it came to dyeing fabrics, so we can better understand how violet and other purples became associated with mourning. Prior to Isaac Newton's experiment, shining a beam of light through a prism and observing the rainbow of refracted light, purple was not always necessarily considered to be the blending of red and blue as we now think of it. There were certainly purple dyes that skewed red from plants such as pokeberries or hibiscus. However, many other sources of purple, such as purple cabbage or purple basil, tend to lean more towards gray, and there are other purple dyes that can even be used in the production of black cloth. Historically, one of the most popular natural purple dyes is made from the logwood tree, quite fittingly named for the fact that when it first arrived on the shores of Europe after its long journey from the New World, it was in the form of logs. Native to Central America, logwood, which is technically a member of the legume family, became a highly sought-after commodity thanks to the rich purple color yielded by its wood. In fact, this dye was in such high demand in Europe that concerns over the harvesting of logwood became a point of contention between the English and Spanish from the 17th to 18th centuries, and was just one of the factors that led the two empires into battle. What made logwood unique was the richness of the dye that could be extracted from it. As mentioned above, Old World purple pigments yielded fabrics that had a more subdued grayish tone. Logwood, on the other hand, could be quite vibrant under the right conditions. It is known to be wash-fast, meaning that it won't lose much color while being laundered. However, it is not very light-fast, so to maintain vibrancy, it is best to be kept out of sunlight. One of the ways the dyers improved logwood's light-fastness was to introduce iron into the dyeing process, which darkened the color. But it didn't only darken the color. Adding iron to the logwood mix created a dye that was just about the closest thing to black available, which further added to the value of the crop. It became so popular, in fact, that nearly all black cloth in the 18th century was dyed using logwood. And this could be the major connection of violet to black in terms of mourning attire. Considering that black was made using purple dye, and the dye's struggle with light fastness, which could cause fading over time, the transition from black to gray to purple can be found here with logwood. However, it should be noted that there is another connection between purple and black when it comes to the dyeing of fabrics. There are regulatory texts explaining the organization and rules surrounding the textile industry of 13th century Europe, as mentioned by noted medieval historian Michael Pastoureau in his book, Black, The History of a Color. He goes on to explain that beginning at this time, there were regulations forbidding dyers who worked with red pigments from using blue ones, and vice versa. So those who dyed with reds were also allowed to work with yellows and whites, and those who were licensed to work with blue dyes were also permitted to use greens and blacks. Black dyes during this time were notoriously temperamental, uneven, and never a true black, but instead appeared more brown, gray, or blue. They were exclusively derived from specific trees, like the one previously mentioned, and usually came from the bark or roots. There was also normally an iron mordant used as a fixative to allow the dye to be more color-fast, and this iron element also helped to deepen the shade of black. Another way a dyer would obtain a darker black would be to pre-dye a piece of cloth blue as deep and vibrant as they could before using black to over-dye the fabric, ensuring that it would have a deeper, richer color. Since only licensed blue dyers were legally permitted to dye with black, the black took on a bluish-purplish tint, further aligning it with purple and violet. However, the dyed fabric associated with the color violet pales in comparison to some of the high-impact vibrancy of the actual flower. Though some are fairer shades, many varieties feature bold purples, blues, and even yellows, making violets easily recognizable both in gardens and in the wild. This seems, at first glance, to be at odds with the common idiom, shrinking violet, a phrase which was first used in a poem by writer Leigh Hunt, peer to famed writers Percy Shelley, John Keats, and Alfred Lord Tennyson, and a well-known figure in English Romanticism, a popular artistic movement from the 18th to 19th centuries. Romanticism in this context was initially defined as literature depicting emotional matter in an imaginative form by poet and literary critic Friedrich Schlegel, who is thought to be the first person to employ the term. This, of course, is a very simplified definition of the artistic philosophy, even by the standards of Schlegel himself, but it is a topic deserving of its own episode, so we will leave it to be explored in detail another day. What Romanticism as a movement comes down to is an infatuation with the ideals of individualism, freedom, and devotion to love, beauty, and nature. Through this lens, we can see how the phrase shrinking violet would come to life in Hunt's prose. There is the buttercup struggling from white to a dirty yellow, and a faint-colored poppy, neither the good nor the ill of which was then known, and here and there, by the thorny underwood, a shrinking violet. Both emotive and imaginative, rooted in nature and easily distinguished imagery, the line is simple but arresting. However, you will notice in this example, Hunt is speaking literally, referencing a flower, as opposed to a person as we have come to use the phrase. What he is speaking of here is the English violet, known as a small flower which often got lost under its own large leaves, hence the mention of shrinking. The common usage of the idiom to describe a person as being shy or modest would not enter the English lexicon until the following decades. The flower itself, which lends its name to the iconic shade of purple, is a member of the genus known as Viola. Interestingly, the name Viola, in reference to the small flower, was first coined by Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus, who we mentioned in our deep dive into the word fauna, where we actually dedicated a small section to the etymology of his own name as a little bonus. Thank you so much for listening all the way through if you did. Please leave a like if you would like to hear more episodes. Also, feel free to leave a comment if there are any words you would like to see covered in the future.